Hey, my name is Nathan. I'm 31 years old. I live in a 2-room apartment above a hardware store on the east side of Millbrook, Ohio. Millbrook is the kind of town where you know the intersection before you know the street name, where the gas station on Merchant and 4th has been there longer than most of the people who use it, and where the sign out front still has one letter that flickers at night and nobody calls to complain because after a while you stop seeing it. I'd lived here my whole life except for 2 years after high school when I worked maintenance at a ski resort in West Virginia and thought I was going somewhere. I came back when my father's health turned bad. He recovered. I stayed. I never thought much about whether that said something about me or just about Millbrook. Probably both. For a living, I run Cole Security, which is a name that sounds more substantial than it actually is. It is me and a white Ford Transit van, and a toolbox that weighs around 40 pounds, and an inventory of lock cylinders, deadbolts, strike plates, and keypad entry mechanisms that I keep sorted in labeled bins in the back of the van. I install and repair locks. Residential, mostly. The house on the cul-de-sac where someone lost their keys. The apartment where the tenant changed and the landlord finally got around to calling. The storage unit on the south end of town, where a combination mechanism seized up after a wet summer. I do commercial work when it comes in. Office rekeying, panic bar installations, the occasional safe that someone has forgotten the combination to and needs opened without drilling the casing. I know brands I couldn't have named at 20. I know the sound of a pin stack that's wearing down and the feel of a tumbler that's been forced once too often and never quite recovered. And I know the exact give of a latch that is about 3 weeks away from failing and hasn't been told yet. Most people don't know anything about the locks on their doors until the locks stop working. That's when they call me. I'm good at the work. It suits me in the way that quiet, precise work suits certain people who would rather understand a problem completely before they put a hand to it. My days have a shape to them. I'm up at 6. Coffee from a machine on the counter I bought used from a restaurant equipment sale and have repaired myself 3 times because the heating element has a weak connection where the wire meets the housing. I check the day's jobs on my phone, load whatever parts and tools I'm going to need into the van, and I'm on the road by 7:15. Lunch is whatever I pick up at a gas station or eat in the van outside a job site. I'm usually home by 6, sometimes later in winter when the days go wrong. I heat something up on the stove, eat it standing or at the counter, watch the last few minutes of whatever news program comes on before I realize I'm not really watching it, read for a while in the good chair by the window. I'm asleep by 10. The apartment gets quiet around 7 in the evening and stays that way until the alarm. I'm not lonely in some dramatic way. That's what I would have told you if you'd asked, and I would have meant it. I'd gotten used to the shape of the days. I'd gotten comfortable in the specific silence of a space that is entirely yours and nobody else's. The way the quiet has a texture to it that you stop noticing. The way you stop hearing the refrigerator hum and the pipes settling because they are your refrigerator hum and your pipes settling. I tried not to think too carefully about whether that was a virtue or just a habit I'd stopped examining. Clara had left about 2 years before any of this happened. We'd been together for 3 years, and one evening in April she packed a bag and said, without cruelty and without drama, that she thought I was better at fixing other people's problems than talking about my own. She wasn't wrong. I didn't have a good argument for that. She moved to Columbus, and I heard later she was doing well, and I was genuinely glad for her. And I didn't think about it more often than I had to. For about 2 years before this story begins, I'd been on a call list for a shelter in Millbrook called Crossroads House. Women's shelter, transitional housing, mostly, with a few emergency beds. They needed someone who could change locks on short notice when a situation required it without charging anything. Someone had given them my name. I said yes when they asked, and I kept saying yes every time the phone rang. I went out maybe once a month on average, more in the winter when things seemed to escalate. I drove to an address, changed whatever needed changing, tested the new hardware until I was satisfied, left the keys with whoever was there to receive them, and drove home. I didn't ask questions that were not mine to ask. I figured it was the right thing to do and I kept doing it, and I hadn't spent any time thinking about whether anyone on the other end of those calls had a clear picture of who was showing up. It was just the work. Showing up to work is the thing I know how to do. That was the kind of man I was, I think, in the October that changed things. It was a Wednesday evening in the second week of October. I'd been downtown on a job, a dentist's office on Commerce Street that needed their entry system rekeyed after a staff change. It was just after 4:30 when I finished, and the sky had been the flat gray of an Ohio November that had arrived 6 weeks early, and as I walked the 2 blocks back to my van, the rain came down very suddenly and very hard, the way it does sometimes in fall when a front moves through faster than anyone predicted. I had an umbrella. I carry one in the outer pocket of my tool bag because enough of my work involves walking between a parking space and a building in weather that doesn't care about your timeline. I opened it and walked. She was standing at the bus stop on the corner of Commerce and 7th, dark hair coming out of a ponytail, water starting to collect along the loose strands at her neck, a canvas tote bag on each shoulder, both of them heavy enough that she was standing slightly off-center with the weight. A light jacket, the kind that is fine in September and useless in October rain. She wasn't hunched against it or looking anxiously for the bus or doing any of the things people do when they're miserable in weather. She was just very still, standing in it, like she had assessed the situation and decided that being wet for 20 minutes was a fact she could simply hold. I almost kept walking. The van was a block and a half away. I had leftover pasta at home. I was tired. She was not my problem, and she was not asking to be. But there was something about the particular stillness of her in that rain, the decision she'd made to just be present in the inconvenience of it rather than fight it, that made me stop walking before I'd made a deliberate choice to stop. I walked to the bus stop, held out the umbrella. "You need this more than I do. I'm almost at my van." She looked at the umbrella and then at me, taking a quick inventory. Her eyes were steady, the kind of eyes that file things away as they're looking at them, not just registering surfaces. "Are you sure?" "Yeah." She took it. "Thank you." She turned back to watch for the bus, and I turned and walked. I was 4 steps away when she said, "You're Nathan Cole." I stopped. She was still standing facing the street, the umbrella over her now, rain running off its edge in a thin line. She turned toward me slowly. Her face was calm. No particular expression of surprise or explanation on it, just that same quality of taking careful stock. "Cole Security," she said. "You changed the locks at Crossroads House 3 times in the last 2 years. Once at 1 in the morning, in January. I knew the calls. I could place each of them. I did not know her face." "I'm Mara Lynn," she said. "I'm the director at Crossroads. We've talked on the phone. I don't think we've ever actually seen each other." I stood in the rain getting wet and thought about that. I knew her voice. I'd heard it at midnight, calm and specific, telling me an address and what was needed. She'd always been that way on the phone. No excess words, no apologies for the hour, just the necessary information and a plain thank you at the end. I had not thought carefully about what she looked like. You don't, usually, with a voice you only hear in situations like that. "I didn't place your voice without the context," I said. "It's a different kind of rain than January," she said, which wasn't quite an answer, but wasn't quite, not one. Her bus wasn't due for 10 minutes. The rain was heavy enough that standing in it for 10 minutes felt like a reasonable reason for the conversation that followed. I asked where she was headed. She named a neighborhood on the east side of town, not far from where I was going. I offered her a ride, and then immediately thought about whether that was the right call given the work, whether it was the kind of thing I was supposed to do or not supposed to do, and she watched me think about it with the same even expression and said, "You've been vouched for by approximately 11 women who let you into their apartments in the middle of the night." "I think I'm all right." "Okay," I said. She didn't talk much in the van. The tote bags were heavy. She'd been at a planning meeting that had run long and had stopped at the food bank beforehand to pick up a donation for the shelter. She was updating a list on her phone with one thumb, not performing busyness, but actually doing a thing that needed doing. The rain was letting up. The streets were wet, and the streetlights were just starting to come on, turning everything a warm amber that the wet pavement doubled underneath us. I pulled up in front of Crossroads' house. She gathered the bags and got out and said, from the sidewalk with the van door still open, "Thank you, Nathan." She said my name the way you say a name you have known for a while and are saying aloud for the first time, familiar with it before she used it. "Sure," I said. "Take care." She went inside. I drove home. I ate the pasta. The apartment was quiet in the way it always was. I went to sleep at 10. She called 2 days later on a Friday afternoon. The shelter's storage unit had a combination lock that had seized. Damp had probably gotten into the mechanism over the summer and corroded it from the inside. They had a donation pickup scheduled for Saturday morning and couldn't get the unit open. Could I come by? I came by Saturday. She was there, which I hadn't necessarily expected. She was working inside the unit while I dealt with the lock, sorting through boxes, making a running inventory on a clipboard, moving things with the efficient economy of someone who knows exactly where everything goes because she put it there. I was on the ground with my tools, and the lock was bad enough that it needed a full replacement rather than a repair, and we talked the way you talk when both people are doing separate tasks, and the conversation is something that happens alongside the work rather than instead of it. She'd run a shelter in Detroit for 4 years, she told me. Larger operation, full staff, better funding, more resources. She'd heard about Crossroads through a national network, a shelter at risk of closure, run by a volunteer coordinator who had been carrying it mostly alone and was burning out. She'd come down to assess it and write a transition report. She'd stayed for a month. Then, another month. Then, she'd signed a lease. Was that the plan? I said, working the drill to seat the new lock housing. Mostly the second thing, she said. She was stacking labeled boxes with unhurried precision. I was supposed to come for a week and tell them what they needed to do and go back. But the situation was, the bones were good. The community actually needed it. It just needed someone to stay. And it's working? Mostly, she moved a heavy box to the back wall without asking for help. The funding is precarious. It's always precarious. But the shelter is open. Occupancy is up. And the referral network with the county is better than it was. So yes, mostly, I finished with the mechanism and stood up and tested it 6 or 7 times. Clean, solid, would hold up in weather. I showed her how the combination reset function worked. The old one was trying to function after it had been compromised too many times, I said. A lock that's been gotten into the wrong way doesn't quite sit right in the frame again. Once that happens, you replace it. You don't keep trying to repair what's been forced. She paused in her organizing and looked at me. Just for a moment. "Yeah," she said, like I had said something she recognized from somewhere other than locks. We got coffee from the cafe across the street after the unit was secured. She had her wallet out before I'd finished putting my tools away and paid before I could say anything. "You've worked here for free for 2 years," she said. "Let me pay for coffee." I didn't have a good argument for that, so I didn't make one. We sat for almost an hour and talked about things that didn't have much weight to them, which is a different thing from the conversation being meaningless. She had the right amount of silence in her. I had the same. We left when we both had somewhere else to be, and I drove back to the van thinking, she is someone who knows exactly what she is doing at all times and does not need anyone to notice that she knows. A week later, she called about a job that wasn't storage units. A woman who had recently left the shelter had moved into a new apartment, and the existing lock was a cheap lever handle that wasn't going to give anyone much confidence. Would I go? I went. The woman was young, 22, maybe 23. She had the way of standing that belongs to someone who has gotten used to taking up less space than they're owed. She made tea in the small kitchen while I worked on the door and asked Mara, in a low voice that she didn't quite make low enough, Is he okay to have here?" She meant it the way she had to mean it, given what had brought her to this apartment. Mara said, without any pause to indicate she was choosing her words, "He's the safest person I've sent to someone's door." I kept my hands on the drill. I didn't look up or change the pace of what I was doing. Afterward, in the parking lot of the building in the late afternoon light, I said to Mara, "You told her I was safe." "You are. How do you know that?" She looked at me for a moment, not a long look, a specific one. "I know how long you stay on a job. I know you don't ask questions that aren't yours to ask. I know that the second time you came to the shelter, there was a woman who was frightened of any man she didn't know. She would barely be in the same room. You changed her lock while she waited in the hallway, and when you left you put a folded note under her door with your name and your number and a sentence that said, 'If the lock ever gives you trouble, call me and I'll come.' Nobody asked you to do that. I had not thought about that note in a long time. It seemed like the right thing," I said. "I know," she said. "That's the point." She walked to her car. I stood in the parking lot for a moment. My hands were in my jacket pockets. The afternoon had gone to that particular gray that means rain within the hour. I drove home and sat in the parking lot of my building without getting out for a few minutes, the engine ticking as it cooled. She called over the next few weeks about things that weren't emergencies. A question about a deadbolt for her own apartment. What brand? What grade? Was the cylinder replaceable without replacing the whole unit? Then, on a Thursday, she was going to Ashby's for coffee at 2. Was I free? Not framed as a question that required deliberation. Just, "I'm doing a thing. You can come if you want." I went. We talked for close to 2 hours. She had grown up in Cleveland, younger of 2 kids. Her father had worked at a print shop for 30 years, and her mother had been a school nurse. Her brother taught 4th grade in Akron and had 3 kids, and called her every Sunday to report on what chaos they had gotten into that week. She read detective novels, but always read the ending first, which she defended not as cheating but as a preference for knowing the destination, rather than dreading whether the journey was going somewhere worth going. I told her I'd never read the ending of anything first. She said, "You wait to find out if a lock works by testing it, don't you?" I said yes. She said, "Same principle." I told her about Clara, briefly, the way you tell a thing when it's real but it's been held a while, and the edges have worn smooth. 3 years, she left. She was right to. I understood it better now than I had at the time. Mara listened and did not press. After a moment, she said, "I know what it's like to be better at solving things for people you don't know than at keeping things intact with people you do." She looked out the window at the street. I've been working on that, I said. Me too. And I meant it, though I hadn't thought about it in exactly those words before she put them there. About 2 weeks after that, she called me about an issue with the shelter's keypad entry panel. It had been throwing error codes intermittently, and the staff kept getting locked out at inconvenient hours. I came by on a Friday afternoon and found her already on her back on the floor in front of the panel with a small flashlight between her teeth, examining the wiring connection at the base of the housing. I stood in the doorway for a moment. She pulled the flashlight out. The positive wire is corroded at the connector. I think that's what's causing the dropout. I was going to resplice it, but I didn't want to make it worse. She held the flashlight up toward the ceiling so I could see the wiring she meant. She was correct. The corrosion was exactly where she said it was, and the splice she was proposing was the right fix. "Where'd you learn wiring?" I asked, crouching down beside her. "Detroit," she said. "When you run a building on a tight budget, you fix what you can yourself, or you wait 3 weeks for a contractor. I got good at figuring out what I could do safely." She handed me the flashlight. "You do this part. My hands are too big for the connector housing." I had a smaller set of pliers in my kit. I did the splice. While I worked, she held the flashlight exactly where I needed it without being asked, which is rarer than it sounds. Most people move it around, trying to be helpful, and end up making things harder. She held it still and at the right angle and asked 2 questions about the process. Specific ones, and listened to the answers. When the panel came back on clean, I ran the test cycle twice. She watched the sequence without asking me to explain it. "You already know what you're looking at," I said. "I know enough to know when it's working and when it's not," she said. "That's the part that matters." We left Ashby's when they started stacking chairs. She said goodnight in the parking lot and walked to her car, and I stood by my van and watched her go and thought, this is someone I want to keep knowing. Then I drove home and decided that was a fact I could simply hold for a while without needing to do anything about it yet. On a Thursday evening in November, we moved a donated bookcase from a shelter van to the main room. It was solid old furniture, the heavy kind that doesn't come apart, and it took 2 attempts to get the angle right through the door and a third to set it exactly where Mara wanted it against the wall. Afterward, we sat on the front step because neither of us was quite ready to go back to whatever came next. The parking lot was empty and cold. Someone had left 2 paper cups of coffee on the step, and they were cold too, and we drank them anyway. She told me about Detroit. Not the whole of it, just one thing. A woman she hadn't been able to help in time. She said it in 4 sentences with no added weight, no editorial comment. The way you say a thing when you've said it enough times to yourself that the words are worn smooth, but the shape of it still sits where it always sat. She said, "I went over everything I could have done differently for a long time. Do you still?" I asked. "Sometimes less than before. What changed?" She was quiet for a moment. The parking lot light made a small circle on the wet asphalt in front of us. "Coming here helped. The work here is smaller and closer. You see what you accomplish more clearly." She paused. "Some of the people I work with helped." She looked at the ground. "You helped, actually, without knowing you were doing it." I looked at the same piece of wet asphalt she was looking at. "I just changed locks," I said. "I know that's what you think," she said. But to a woman standing in a new apartment at midnight, wondering if she is actually safe now, someone coming in the cold and making that door solid and leaving a note that says, "Call me if you need anything," that is not nothing. That is the whole world, sometimes. She put her hand over mine on the step between us. Not for long. Just there. And then, not. I registered it, and did not analyze it, and did not name it. I just recorded it the way you record the thing you know you're going to think about later. I walked to my van and drove home and sat in the dark of my apartment for a while before turning the lights on. The quiet felt different. Not bad different, just different. Like the apartment had the same dimensions it always had, and I was now suddenly aware of all of them. In December, the shelter got a certified letter. The building's owner, a man named Garrett Hale, was not renewing the lease when it expired in March. He had a developer interested in the property for mixed-use retail, and the economics had shifted, and he was sorry, but these things happened. Mara called me to ask whether I could still do the security upgrade we'd been planning. Motion sensors, updated entry panel, if they had to relocate, or whether it made more sense to wait until they had a new address. Her voice on the phone was the same as it always was. She was already in the next problem before the current one had fully arrived. I said let's keep it on the schedule, and I came in the following week for a meeting with the board member who had arranged a final conversation with Hale, just to see if terms could be negotiated. Patricia was her name. She'd been running the shelter's fundraising for 12 years and had the quality of someone who had seen every version of this situation and was still here. Hale came with one of his property managers. He was in his early 60s in a good wool coat, carrying the particular certainty of a man who had not been told no in a room he didn't control in a very long time. He addressed his case to Patricia for the most part. Market conditions. The neighborhood's development potential, the need for Millbrook's commercial district to grow its tax base and become more viable for younger residents. He was reasonable. He was not unkind. He was also entirely clear that he had made his decision before arriving, and the conversation was a courtesy rather than a negotiation. As he was gathering his things to leave, he turned back toward the room and said to Mara, almost as an aside, the kind of aside that carries more weight than the main remarks, that she had done excellent work, that it was clear she was committed, but that sometimes the nature of community needs evolved, and perhaps this particular resource was less critical than it had once been. My hands were still on the table. I kept them there. Mara said, "Would you like me to tell you what's still required here, or is that a rhetorical observation you're making?" Hale looked at her. "Because I can give you 3 names," she said. Her voice was even. "No performance in it. Women who arrived here in the last 90 days. I can tell you what each of them arrived with, what they have now, and what they would have if this building were a retail space in March. If you're prepared to make a case to me that the situations that bring people to Crossroads House have stopped occurring in Millbrook, I'm ready to hear that case." The room was quiet, in the way rooms get quiet, when the thing that needed to be said has been said, and everyone present knows it. Hale said that he understood, and that he respected her dedication, and left. Patricia looked at Mara, said, "Well." Mara wrote something on her notepad. I stayed to finish the conversation about the security work. Patricia left. It was just us and the empty chairs and the late afternoon light coming through the window over the reception desk. "You didn't need me to say anything," I said. "No, I know." She looked up from her notepad. "Thank you for being there." I drove home slowly. I thought about what it meant to be the person who shows up. Not to intervene, not to fix, not to make anything happen, just to stand in the room so that the room has a different quality to it. I hadn't known until tonight that that was something I could be. 3 weeks later, an advocacy organization Mara had been in contact with for months came through with something useful. Hale's development company had received a public economic grant 3 years prior, with community benefit provisions attached to the terms. A lawyer the organization connected them with drafted a letter. Hale's office responded. There was a period of back and forth I only heard about in pieces, in phone calls and brief updates from Mara. In January, Crossroads House received a 3-year lease extension and a reduction in the monthly rent by enough to make a difference. She sent me a text. Lease is signed. 3 years. Thank you for coming to that meeting. I looked at it for a moment and wrote back. You did that. I just sat there. She sent back, I know. That was enough. I sat with that for a while. I kept doing the work I'd always done. Jobs during the week. Crossroads on whatever day she called. The Tuesday morning coffee on the reception desk. But something had been clarified by the Hale situation that I hadn't been able to clarify for myself. Watching her address him, not with anger, not with performance, just with plain and specific truth, I had understood something about the quality of her that I had been circling around for months without naming. She was not hard. She was solid. Those are different things. A hard thing is rigid because it has stopped being able to be otherwise. A solid thing is dependable because it knows exactly what it is and doesn't have to prove it. I knew the difference. I worked with materials every day. And I had been, for months, in the presence of someone I could recognize as solid in the way you recognize good hardware. Not by what it looks like, but by how it performs when something actually requires it. That was what I kept not saying out loud. I had become a person who found reasons to be at the shelter on days when no job required me there. I had installed a motion sensor that should have taken me 40 minutes and stretched to 2 hours because Mara was working in the next room and occasionally came to the doorway with a question. I had been leaving a coffee on the reception desk on Tuesday mornings without saying anything about it or waiting to see if it was noticed. I had become, without planning to, someone who arranged his day around the chance of seeing a specific person. And I had spent approximately 3 months calling that something other than what it was because it was easier than knowing what to do with it. She had noticed. I was certain she had noticed. Mara Lynn noticed everything. One evening in late February, we were the last 2 people in the shelter after a volunteer appreciation dinner. The other volunteers had filtered out. Patricia had gone. The caterer had packed up. The main room was quiet. Chairs up on most of the tables. The overhead lights turned to low. That particular stillness of a building after people have been in it and then left. Mara was putting on her coat. I said, "Can I say something?" She stopped and looked at me and waited. She did not help me start. She just waited, with the same patience she brought to everything. "I've been giving myself a lot of reasons not to say this," I said. The professional, I stopped, started again. That's mostly just me being slow. I'm good at understanding mechanisms. I'm less good at saying what I mean before I've thought about it 11 more times than necessary. She was still waiting. "I've been in love with you for a while," I said. I didn't say it because I am better at showing up quietly than at saying the actual thing out loud, but I'm saying it now. She looked at me for a long moment. Her expression did what it did when she was making a careful inventory of something. Not guarded, just precise. Taking stock. "You want to know what I thought?" she said, "the first time I actually saw you in person? At the bus stop." "What?" I thought, "He looks exactly like I expected him to look." She pulled the second button of her coat closed. Solid, a little careful, already carrying an umbrella when it had barely started raining. She paused. "Nathan, I have been waiting for you to say that since approximately the 3rd time you showed up here when nobody called you." I said. "I'm slow. I know," she said. I already knew that too. She stepped toward me and I met her halfway, and the room was very quiet. And it had been a long time since I'd kissed anyone, and it felt exactly like what it actually was. A key. Finally, that had been cut for a specific lock. And the lock turning with the kind of ease that only happens when everything is the right fit. 8 months later, Crossroads House is still open. Mara added 2 new positions to the staff in the spring, a case manager and a part-time counselor, both funded by a grant she had been working on since the previous November. There's a mural on the east wall of the main room, painted by 2 residents as a going-away gift when they transitioned to permanent housing. I painted the door frame that same week, which had needed it for 2 years, and stood back and looked at both things and thought they worked together. She came to stand beside me and look at it too and said, "It's good." Not the mural and not the door frame specifically. Both things. I understood what she meant. The keypad entry system is updated and hasn't thrown an error code since March. Patricia found a catering company to donate monthly meals for shelter dinners, which means Mara doesn't have to run the food bank pickup anymore, and I notice she gets home an hour earlier on those Thursdays. There is a new bolt lock on the storage unit that will not corrode, and a motion sensor in the east parking lot that I installed in February and never billed for, and she never mentioned, which means we both understood it the same way. Her brother David came in March for a long weekend and spent most of Saturday dinner asking me questions about the locksmith trade with a genuine interest that I wasn't entirely prepared for. He had the quality of a person who is completely at ease with whatever the current conversation is, and would be equally at ease with a completely different one. Mara sat at the other end of the table and ate her food and said almost nothing during our conversation. Once I looked up and caught her watching, not watching the conversation, watching me in it. She looked at her plate. I looked back at David and kept talking about the difference between a pin tumbler and a wafer tumbler, and he nodded like this was the most interesting thing he'd heard in weeks, which is the kind of person I'd have chosen for her brother if I'd been asked. On Tuesday evenings, I'm at her apartment. She buys the groceries. I cook, which I'm adequate at, and she is not. And she is genuinely comfortable admitting this, which is one of the many things I've learned to love about how she moves through the world. She reads while I cook, always a detective novel, always already on the last chapter, because she read the ending first, and now she's finding out how it got there. The apartment has a radiator that makes a sound when the heat comes on, a soft knock that I traced to a loose bracket the second time I was there for any length of time. She looked up from her book when I mentioned it. I told her I could fix it in 15 minutes. She said, "Don't." I looked at her. "I like the sound," she said. "It means the heat came on." I put my wrench back. Some things are not broken just because they make a noise. I've spent enough time around locks to know the difference between a mechanism failing and a mechanism doing exactly what it was designed to do. Last week she was on the phone with a contractor about the shelter's exterior lighting when I came in, and she pointed at the coffee maker without looking up and mouthed the word "please." And I made us both a cup and set hers on the desk beside her without interrupting, and she put her hand briefly on my arm as I passed and didn't look up from the call. That was all. Nothing about it required an explanation. I used to think that being known by someone required you to spend a long time building something they could examine, a record, a presentation, something arranged and offered so they could look it over and decide. But I had spent 2 years being exactly who I was, alone in the dark at midnight, in hallways that smelled like industrial carpet and old paint, with nothing but a toolbox and a door I was not charging anyone to secure. I had not been building anything. I had just been doing what seemed right, and without knowing it, I had been showing someone everything. All of it, the patience, the showing up without being asked, the notes left for women who were scared, the willingness to drive anywhere at any hour without making it a thing, the choice to do the right thing when no one was watching and no one would ever know, and there was nothing in it for me at all. She had been watching. She had been building a picture, and the picture she built was the true one, which is the only kind that lasts. Maybe you don't have to arrange yourself carefully into something worth knowing. Maybe you just have to be who you are, quietly, long enough, in the cold if that's what's required. And eventually someone will turn around in the rain, take your umbrella, and say, I already know you.